Good afternoon and welcome back to the fourth in our series of Moving Up to Enterprise Leadership, the 7 Seismic Shifts. I'm joined today by Professor Michael Watkins. Michael, thank you for being here yet again to look at these 7 seismic shifts.
Good to be back, Paul.
Today we're looking at the 4th shift, which you're saying is moving from bricklayer to architect. On the face of it, this seems to be all about the ability to create the right organizational context.
So I think that's largely correct, right? The way I sort of think about it is organizations are systems, right? They have different elements to them. We've talked about one previous session, strategy, but there's structure, there's the processes, there's the talent bases of the organization, the key systems and so on. And you really need to have those, first of all, match the demands of the environment, but also fit among themselves, right? To understand that basically if you change one piece of it, you probably have to change multiple pieces of it because they really are linked together in fairly intricate and important ways.
So what do you need to do to be a good architect?
Well, so let's step back and sort of ask the question, what does it mean to be a bad architect? Because I think that's not a bad place to begin, right? I sort of joke that I see lots of senior leaders, commit what I think of as organizational design malpractice. And a very simple example, which I'm sure you've never seen happen, which is you have a leader who comes in to an organization. They may not have a long period of time in the role, 2 or 3 years. They want to make their mark, right? They want to have an impact on the organization. 2 easy ways to do that are to change the strategy, right, or to change the structure. Strategy, we can go off in a room someplace together and come up with a new strategy, roll it out, terrific, I've got a new strategy in place. Right? The problem is that often the organization does not necessarily need a new strategy. What it needs is some tuning of the strategy or some refinement on the execution, but that doesn't feel like you're really making a visible contribution. Or another example of malpractice is, I just decide that I need to restructure this thing in some way, right? I'll move the boxes around a little bit, change the reporting relationships. I'll decide we need to go from a functional structure to a product-focused structure or the existing structure to a matrix. And it all sounds fairly straightforward until you realize the depth of the impact that has on an organization. So I worry a lot about leaders that, first of all, don't understand necessarily the complex sets of connections between those elements. And secondly, begin to try to do things that are on the face of it easy, but in reality have profoundly, big impacts on organizations. And they do them for the wrong reasons.
So I can understand what you're saying about the desire to go for a quick win, to make something visible. I guess if we stick with the architect metaphor, coming in with something which looks beautiful on the outside and people can stand back and say, wow. How, if I'm a new leader moving up to an enterprise leadership role, how can I get up to speed quickly enough with the impact of the decisions that I make or don't make, so I don't fall into the trap of going for a quick win and then suddenly finding myself in a tricky situation?
So I think the first step is really understanding the fundamental nature of the situation that you're being asked to lead. I worry a lot that people think that there's sort of one way to lead change in organizations, when in reality, it really is a question of what kind of change are you there to lead. And so I've developed a framework, my previous work in the first 90 days called the STARS framework, right? Startup, turnaround, accelerated growth, realignment, sustaining success. And one of the fundamental premises there was there are multiple kinds of change that you might be called upon to lead. And so if it's a turnaround scenario, right? If there's a disaster in progress going on, Paul, it may well be the right thing to come in and say, look, the strategy isn't working, right? The team isn't working, right? We need a lot of new people on the team. Once we've got the strategy, we'll think about the structure, right? That can make complete sense. But contrast that with what I think of as a realignment scenario, where you're not in a major crisis, right? Many people may not necessarily even be aware that there's a big issue. You come into that situation, the strategy may not be the issue at all, right? It may be that the underlying culture has got some issues. It may be that some key processes are not functioning the way that they should. And what I want leaders to do at moments like that is not decide that changing the strategy is still the right answer, right? I want them to dig in and understand at a pretty deep level what are the fundamental drivers of what's going on in the business and what is it that really needs to be changed here. Now, this can be difficult because working with culture and working with processes, That's down in the guts of the organization, and it's hard work, and it takes time. But if you don't do that work, right, you're creating a kind of a disconnect in the organization, which over time can be very damaging, because what happens is the next leader comes in and does it all over again. And pretty soon you've created this schism in the organization.
So when you talk there about processes and structures and cultures, people watching today might say, but isn't that the role of HR? Isn't that really their domain rather than the enterprise leader?
If you believe that, you're in a lot of trouble, I think. I think that if you don't believe that those core elements of organizations are part of your responsibility as an architect and as an enterprise leader, you're in deep trouble, right? Because, you know, so much of what makes organizations great resides at the level of the culture, right? You're there to be a steward of the culture if it's a good culture. You're there to really try to create a great culture if there isn't one there. And that's a core responsibility of enterprise leadership. HR can help, right? Especially the people in HR that are good, you know, organizational design people are indispensable resources at times like that, but there's no delegating away that responsibility.
So coming into an organization, whether I've moved up the ranks or I've come in from outside, what tips could you give people today to help them get up to speed quickly with the culture, get a feel for, put their finger on the pulse to try and understand what kind of culture am I operating in here?
Well, the starting place is typically on the team you've inherited, right? And so, I mean, the easiest place to begin to see what happens is by spending time with your team, observing how they're functioning, digging into, you know, the place I typically look at is if things have not happened the way they should have, let's begin to use those as almost case studies of why did this happen. And I don't mean being punitive, and I don't mean going, you know, after people, but let's dig down and really understand how was it that we made that decision, right? Because that decision in retrospect was clearly not a good one, right? Or why is it that we're seeing a productivity, you know, set of problems pretty universally across some key plants would be another example, right? What's going on at the level of those plants that's undermining the climate, right? And not making people put out that kind of discretionary effort. So I think you've got to sort of find the right focal points and then spend a fair amount of attention, you know, really trying to understand what's going on there.
So once you feel like you've kind of got up to speed in this, a lot of what you're saying today sounds a lot about working with your team, making sure that your team's performing well, pulling the best performance out of the people that you're working with, and hopefully getting those people to pull the best out of the performance of their teams. How can you do that? How can you, in concrete terms, how can you really ensure that you're getting the best bang for your buck from the potential of the people in your team?
Sure. So you're now in the realm of understanding what engagement means and motivation means at a pretty fundamental level. And as with many of these elements, we've learned a tremendous amount about this, right? There's some science behind this now, where it used to be art behind designing organizations, right? Where do you start? What are some of the key connections? What's the right way to sequence? There's pretty good research now about what is it that fundamentally drives discretionary effort. An example for frontline people, the most important driver of discretionary effort is typically their boss, that first level supervisor. You take that observation and you say, well, are we putting enough effort into selecting and developing those frontline people, right, to make sure that they're doing the right things, right, which is typically providing the right kinds of support and coaching to people at the lower levels that really is going to get, you know, the most discretionary effort from them. So you can take some of the observations of that kind of science of engagement and begin to really apply them, you know. And I do think, Paul, I agree with you that this is a core part of being an effective architect, is understanding some of that science.
Michael, thanks so much for sharing with us today this fourth shift, moving from bricklayer to architect. Thank you very much.